All right then. So we're going to take our last portion of Deuteronomy. We've talked about much of it, but we're going to go in just a little bit more detail, not much, through the matters of the second discourse of Moses, which is the longest, and just going through chapter by chapter and summarizing what's there. There's not remaining very much, probably more to say in this lecture, so I'm hoping to end in time to give a little bit of Q&A time. Chapter 15, we didn't talk about that. We talked about the chapter 14, which is with the clean and unclean animals. Chapter 15 talks about what's called the year of release, the 7th year of every cycle of years. Every 7th year was supposed to be a Sabbath year. Remember, it was earlier said they're not supposed to farm their ground on the 7th year. They're supposed to let it lay fallow. There would be some food that would come up on its own, even though they didn't sow new seed, because the previous year when they harvested, there would be some individual seeds that would fall just from falling off the heads of grain while they're harvesting. Those would take root, and there'd be some food would grow in the ground, even though they weren't farming it. That food was to be left to the poor. The poor were supposed to be able to go through and eat whatever comes up by itself. But Deuteronomy 15 tells us more about the 7th year, and that is that it's also supposed to be a time when all debts are canceled, and especially when if people had borrowed money using their land as collateral and had never gotten their debt fully paid off, their land is supposed to go back to them anyway in the 7th year. That's pretty much what the year of release is. And also servants are supposed to release. So it's sort of like a year of Jubilee, only every 7 years. I'm not, in fact, entirely clear on what the difference is between the year of Jubilee and the year of release. It seems like the provisions for both are pretty similar. Every 7th year was a year of release, a Sabbath year. And then after 7 of those, which would be after 49 years, the next year, the 50th, would be the Jubilee. So they kind of have 2 of them in a row. The 49th year would be a Sabbath year. Then the next year, the year of Jubilee, I'm not really sure what would be left to be done on the Jubilee that had not been done the previous year, as far as releasing debts and things like that. But that's not for us to worry about because we don't have to do it. I'm sure that was clearer to them. I'm sure there's more told to them than we have in writing, so we don't have to sort all the details out. Chapter 16 reviews the 3 festivals that they're supposed to keep. Now, of course, the Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, each of them were week-long festivals. The male Jews over 12 years old, pretty much, were required to make, or if they could, a pilgrimage to the tabernacle and observe these festivals 3 times a year. Eventually, of course, the Jews were scattered all over the world because of the diaspora. That is, because the Jews had been taken into captivity and not all of them returned. And so Jews of the diaspora, which are the scattered throughout the world, they apparently were not required to come every time, but they were supposed to as often as they could. And that's why there were Jews from every country in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Jews were supposed to go to Jerusalem for that, but certainly they couldn't come from Rome and Spain and Britain and places like that every 3 times a year. They'd never be home because of the travel time and all that. But nonetheless, it does review those festivals, which have been, they came up in Exodus, they came up in Leviticus, they come up now again here in Deuteronomy. That's in chapter 16. Now, chapter 17 has something in it of interest. Chapter 17, verses 14 through 20, we should take a look at it. It's the laws concerning a king. Now, Israel didn't have a king in Moses' day or Joshua's day or for several hundred years after, because God was their king. They were God's kingdom, and he did not really want them to have an earthly king. But the time came in the days of Samuel, in 1 Samuel 8, that the people kind of demanded that they be given a king, which was not pleasing to God or to Samuel, because God said, they're rejecting me from being the king over them. But he gave them a king anyway, Saul. But in Hosea, he said, I gave you a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. God gave them a king because they demanded it, but he wasn't happy about it. Nonetheless, in Deuteronomy 20, Moses anticipates them when they're going to, in fact, be asking for a king. Did I say 20? It's 17. Excuse me. Verses 14 through 20. Sorry about that. So, in chapter 17, beginning at verse 14, we read, when you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it, and dwell in it, and when you say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren. You shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother, but he shall not multiply horses for himself, which would be military equipment. Horses were not ordinary transportation. Mules and camels were used more for ordinary transportation. A horse was considered to be a battle animal, so it'd be like military equipment. He shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Then it goes on to say that when he becomes a king, he has to make his own handwritten copy of the law and read it every day so that he can govern according to the law. Now, it wasn't really God's first choice that Israel even have a human king. But he anticipates that the time will come when they're going to be kind of wanting one, demanding one. So he says, well, when it comes to that, make sure you let God choose the king. And make sure that he makes a copy of the law and reads it every day so that he can follow it. And he should not do what other kings do. He shouldn't multiply military power or wives or money. Now, Solomon violated all three of those things. David did in some measure. David had 8 wives. Solomon had 700. Perhaps David felt like he wasn't multiplying wives, he was just adding. There's a difference between adding and multiplying, perhaps. Having 8, maybe that's just adding, but having 700, that's definitely multiplying. Now, we have to realize that the reason that kings had many wives often, for one thing, it is prestigious to have a big harem, but more than that, they made political alliances through marriage with other nations. This is often how they entered into mutual non-aggression treaties with other nations. Okay, my son, I'm the king here. My son will marry the daughter of that king over there. Their marriage joins our 2 kingdoms in such a way that we clearly will be on each other's side. We will not be attacking each other. This is the way treaties were often made in the Middle East between kingdoms. And so marrying multiple wives often had very little to do with being in love with multiple women. Had to do with, well, your dad was the king over there, and I'm marrying you so that we won't have any wars between our 2 kingdoms, They weren't marrying for love all the time. Now, people did marry for love sometimes in biblical times, but it wasn't always assumed. We always assume you don't marry someone unless you're in love with them. Well, certainly that phenomenon of marrying for love was known. Jacob loved Rachel, for example. Isaac loved Rebekah. Men sometimes loved their wives in the Old Testament as well as at any time in history, but they also sometimes took wives for pragmatic reasons, like I said, for political reasons, or even for just to build a family. If a first wife was barren, as in the case of Sarah. Sarah was barren, so she suggested that Abraham have a child by Hagar. Rachel was barren, so she suggested that Jacob have children by Bilhah, her maid, and so forth. So, it was often the case that marriage wasn't, even the wife might recommend, hey, why don't you have a baby by this woman? You could see that the expectations of love and marriage and sex and things like that were viewed a little differently in that culture. One thing is that having children was very important to leave your estate to and to carry on the remembrance of your name after you're dead. So anyway, people did have multiple wives sometimes in the Old Testament, and some kings violated this, but God said, don't multiply wives. The king should not multiply wives. He shouldn't multiply wealth. He shouldn't multiply horses. Now, that's not strictly speaking of monogamy there, because to not multiply horses doesn't mean you only have one horse. To not multiply gold and silver doesn't mean you only have one coin of gold and silver. It just means that you don't go overboard on it. Now, obviously, in the New Testament, more than one wife is going overboard. You're not allowed to have more than one wife. But under the old Middle Eastern customs, there were various reasons for having multiple wives that were not the reasons we would have. For example, men were often killed off in large numbers in war, leaving a lot of widows or a lot of young women who wouldn't have men to marry because the population of men was decimated. In Isaiah chapter 4, it talks about a situation where there's 7 women for every man after the war. Well, I know you women would rather stay single than share a husband with another woman. But that wasn't the attitude they had back then. For a woman to stay single was kind of a reproach. Every woman wanted to have children. Every woman wanted to have a man. There were women who were widows and who never married for whatever reason, old maids. But generally speaking, marriage again was looked at somewhat differently in that culture. And a woman who had no options to be married except to marry someone who already had a wife, she's better off in a sense. She has someone to care for her, to raise her kids, to give her children, and so forth. So it's a mentality totally different than ours. But what I'm saying is that in telling the king that he cannot multiply wives, it's not strictly speaking saying he has to be monogamous, because in Old Testament times monogamy was not a requirement. But for him to multiply wives would be a suggestion probably that he's making an awful lot of alliances with other countries, which means he's trusting in alliances rather than in God for his protection. Same thing with the military. Don't build up a big military. Not that you can't have a military, but if you expand it overly, you're trusting in your military, not in God. Same thing with your gold. The idea is the king is not supposed to operate on the principles that most pagan Middle Eastern kings operated, where they have as big an army as possible, as big a harem as possible, as much money as possible, but rather to trust in God and be content with modest means and military and family size and so forth. Anyway, that's what chapter 17 talks about, kings. When they finally did have kings, most of the kings didn't follow these instructions. And that's why the nation got into trouble. We've already talked about chapter 18. That's where God talks about raising up a prophet like Moses. And we've talked about that sufficiently. We don't have to talk about chapter 18 further. Chapter 19 is about the cities of refuge. We've already heard about them too, more than once. In fact, the cities of refuge have been mentioned back in chapter 4, verses 41 through 43. This chapter goes into more detail about how the cities of refuge operate. If a man murders another man in cold blood and on purpose, there's no hope for him. He's to be put to death. The person who would put him to death was called the Avenger of Blood. This is because Israel in these early years did not have a centralized government. In fact, until they appointed Saul as king, they didn't have a centralized government. During the period of the judges, there was no centralized government. And therefore, law enforcement sometimes fell to individual families and communities to enforce. And if someone murdered a man or a woman, then that person, the victim's brothers, if he had brothers or cousins or someone related to him, would be in the position to go and avenge the blood of their relative who had been killed. That person who was next of kin to do that would be called the Avenger of Blood. That was his role. Now, if you killed somebody in cold blood, then no one's supposed to protect you from the Avenger of Blood. You're supposed to be put to death. But if it's an accident, and you know it's an accident, well, the Avenger of Blood may not believe it's an accident. The Avenger of Blood may still want to kill you. Right? You kill somebody by accident. The example of an axe head flying off the axe handle and hitting someone in the head and killing him was given as a kind of example of someone accidentally killing somebody. Well, that person could be a target for the Avenger of Blood, who may not be all that convinced that it was an accident. So if you've killed someone accidentally, you have to flee from the Avenger of Blood to the city of refuge. In the city of refuge, they would give you a fair trial. If they found you did not deliberately kill someone, then you could live in the city of refuge and no Avenger of Blood could come in after you. You'd be safe. You could live the rest of your life in the city of refuge. Although if you went outside of it before the high priest died, interestingly enough, you'd be subject to the Avenger of Blood anyway. So the only hope and only protection for someone who was in danger from having accidentally killed someone was to live in the city of refuge. Now, if you fled there and they had a trial and they found you had done it on purpose, they'd throw you out of the city of refuge, and then the Avenger of Blood would get you. Now, the only thing that's really, I mean, there's a number of things perplexing about this, but the thing that's really perplexing is he has to live in the city of refuge either until he dies or until the high priest dies. There's no explanation of why that would be. I mean, high priests die at random times and they're replaced by their sons and so forth. I mean, why would that have anything to do with a person's, guilt of a crime that they'd committed or whatever? It would seem, perhaps, that this is intended to be a type of Christ. Christ, the high priest's death, releases us from the danger of judgment, basically, for our crimes. The high priest's death allowed a person who had fled to and found refuge in the city of refuge, he could now leave, and the Avenger of Blood could not kill him. If the high priest had died, he was free to go. And he was free no longer to be cooped up in the city of refuge. He's no longer confined, more or less in prison in the city of refuge. He can go. And so it's possible that this is a shadow of Christ's death setting us free from the consequences of our sins too. It's only a guess, but I know no other suggestion, and it seems to be a reasonable one to me. Chapter 20 gives the rules of warfare. Now, Israel was about to go into Canaan and conduct a lot of wars, but these rules don't apply to those wars. The Canaanites were different than other enemies. God told them to wipe out all the Canaanites, not to leave any survivors. But there would be other wars later in their history. After they'd conquered Canaan, there'd be other nations around them that they'd be at war with from time to time. And so the laws of warfare are given in chapter 20. And it makes it very clear. This applies to nations that are not so close to you as the Canaanites. The Canaanites, you're supposed to do something different toward them. But other nations, if you come against one of their cities, you offer them terms of surrender. And if they surrender, you don't hurt them. You put them under tribute. You become a suzerain, basically, and they become your vassal. But if they want to fight you, then fight them. But he did say you spare the women. You don't kill the women. Why? Because they're non-combatants. Now, the Canaanite women and children and everyone was supposed to be taken out. But with other nations that fought against them, they were only supposed to kill the men who were combatants, or even the young men, even boys who were potential combatants, because to leave them alive to rise up and fight again against Israel was something that was not to be desired. Any nation that didn't want this happening to them could just surrender, and then there would be no harm done to them. So, that's the rules in chapter 20 of war. Chapter 21 has a number of things in it. First of all, it envisages a situation where a man is killed, but no one knows who did it. And his body may be found out in the field somewhere, and no one knows who did it. Now, it's very important in the law of Moses that if someone has killed a man, then guilt for that blood has to be atoned for by the blood of the murderer, preferably. But if they don't know who the murderer is, then certain sacrifices have to be offered, and essentially the priests would go out, or the Levites would go out, and they'd measure the distance from the body to the nearest town. And whichever town it was nearest to would be responsible for making the proper sacrifices and so forth to atone for it. And it's this interesting, kind of strange law. In the same chapter, it talks about family relations. One of them one of the laws in there, in verse 15 and following, is if a man has more than one wife, if he has two wives, he has got to treat them fairly, both of them. He might have one that he prefers over the other, but he can't favor the one he loves most. If he's, for example, if the firstborn son of the marriage comes from the wife he doesn't love so much, and the secondborn son comes from the wife he does love, he's got to give the privileges of the firstborn to the son of the wife that he didn't love because he's the firstborn. Now, it's interesting, this itself was different than the way it worked out in Abraham's family, because Ishmael was his firstborn by someone other than his wife that he loved, and but Ishmael didn't get the birthright. But this law is basically saying from this point on, the oldest son gets the birthright, even if he comes from the wife that you didn't love as much as the other wife. Then it talks about a stubborn son, a stubborn and rebellious son who will not submit to his father. The father's supposed to take him out publicly and expose him to the community's scrutiny and make accusations, say, my son is a drunkard and a glutton and he won't obey, and the whole community stones the kid to death. Now again, we don't read of this ever happening, and probably it wouldn't happen very often. I mean, how many sons, knowing that this would happen to them if they're rebellious, would be rebellious? But you see, while people sometimes criticize this kind of a law, we have to realize what it is. Children, obviously the kid's a drunkard, so he's not a little child. We're talking about somebody who's a young man who is out of the control of his parents. His parents can't stop him from being a drunkard and glutton. The son is as big as his dad, apparently, and sons do get to be as big as their dads. And there are, of course, many cases known in our society of kids who are bigger than their parents and who brutalize their parents, who will not submit and sometimes even beat up their parents. Now, that may seem totally foreign to you because if you come from a reasonable family, but there are people like that. And this law basically said, once a son is too big to be controlled by his dad, if he's rebellious against his dad, the community will stand in and enforce it. You see, a son is supposed to respect his father and his mother, no matter whether he's bigger than them or not. And if he doesn't, then the community will take it into their hands, because the dad's not big enough to control his son, but the community is. And so the son, in other words, if he defies his father's authority and the father can't do anything about it, that's not just the end of it. The whole community steps in and says, well, we'll take care of this. That's what they're supposed to do. There should be some kind of enforcement of the community or the government against sons who can't be controlled by their fathers and who abuse their fathers and who are, they're criminals, sons. And that's certainly not an unknown phenomenon. It's also at the end of chapter 21 that we have that strange law that, if you hang someone on a tree, they're cursed, which I already talked about in our first talk on Deuteronomy. Now, chapter 22, we're not going to talk in detail about that. There's miscellaneous laws, including several about sexual morality, who not to sleep with, and what happens to people when they violate it. In chapter 23, the first part of chapter 23 is listing people who are excluded from the sanctuary. Now, these are people who are unclean or who have birth defects of the sort that prevent, or injuries of certain parts of their bodies that prevent them from being able to worship in the sanctuary. I talked about this a long time ago when we first, probably last week. But these laws, God's not punishing people who have these injuries or who have these disabilities. Their disability becomes a teaching point. They represent something. A person who's got a vision defect, a person who's been crushed in his testicles, a person who's got a club foot, a person who's got curvature of the spine, these kinds of things, we think, well, boy, God's really hard on these people. It's not their fault. No, it's not their fault, and he's not faulting them. There's nothing about their condition that prevents them from having a wonderful relationship with God and being with God for eternity. There's no suggestion here that God's got anything against these people. But in the whole ritual drama that God's depicting through the tabernacle service, their condition stands for something in the spiritual realities. And so some of these laws, of course, go against the sensitivities of modern people, but because they don't understand really what's going on. Also, in this chapter, it says that if an Israelite lends money to another Israelite, he can't charge interest on it. He could charge interest from non-Israelites, but not from his brothers. And then there's an exhortation about paying their vows when they make vows at the end of the chapter. Now, chapter 24, speaking of vows, talks about divorce. Now, this is the only actual place in the law that discusses divorce. And what it says is vague enough that it caused a lot of disputes among the Jews, among the rabbis, and even among Christians today. It's in the opening verses of chapter 24. Let me read it, and I'll show you what's ambiguous about it. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, when she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies, who took her as his wife, then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that's an abomination before the Lord. Now, several things are open to question here. Is this saying that it's okay for this woman who's been divorced to be married a second time? Sounds like it. Talks about her being divorced. Her husband gives her a writing of divorcement. She goes and marries another man. But it doesn't actually give her permission to do it, nor forbid it. The way it's worded is very strange. If a man marries a woman, and he finds uncleanness in her, and he gives her a writing of divorcement, and she marries another man, and her second husband detests her or dies, then she can't go back to her first husband. It's all a bunch of, conditions. If this whole thing happens so that the woman's second husband either divorces her or dies, she can't go back to the first husband. Now, that's one of the things that's kind of interesting. It's not clear whether it's giving her permission to enter the second marriage or not. Some think not, and some think so. I think so, but it's not as clear as it could be. Now, another question is, why would it be wrong for her to go back to her second husband? It doesn't suggest it'd be wrong for her to take a third husband if her second husband dies. Maybe she could perhaps be married again, but not to her first husband. Why? Now, that's not explained or even obvious, except it does suggest this, that a woman should not be passed from man to man and back and forth. I mean, a man who divorces his wife, he can't get her back if she marries someone else. This may be protecting her from him trying to reclaim her, or even harassing her second marriage, trying to get her to come back. Even if she left her second husband, she can't come back. Even if he left her, even if he dies. In other words, the man who divorced her the first time, he's canceling all his claims to having her back. That would suggest that a man would be wise not to divorce her lightly. You know, it does not say what uncleanness is the grounds for the divorce here. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the suggestion is a man marries a woman and then finds something he doesn't like about her. There's conflicts between him and her or whatever, and so he gives her a writing of divorcement and sends her away. Well, men might do that rashly. Men might do that, impetuously or impulsively, I should say. And if they did, they might regret it later. She might be a good wife, but he just got angry at her one time and said, I divorce you, or whatever. And then you say, boy, I wish I had her back. Well, then you shouldn't divorce her, because if you divorce her and she marries someone else, you can never have her back. So don't put yourself in that position. Now, it would seem that divorce is permitted, because when this came up in Matthew 19, in the first 9 verses of Matthew 19, the Pharisees said to Jesus, is it lawful to divorce a woman for any cause? Now, what they're asking is this: is there any limit on the causes for which a man might divorce his wife. The reason this was being asked this way is because the law said a man can divorce his wife or may do so if he finds some uncleanness in her. But that's rather vague. What are we talking about uncleanness? I mean, it can't mean ceremonial uncleanness because she's going to be unclean every month. You know? That can't be what it means. It must mean something more severe than that. Now, different rabbis had different opinions about this. There was a leading rabbi a couple generations before Christ was named Shammai, and he had a school of thought, and another rabbi named Hillel had another school of thought. And they had differences on this very point. And in Jesus' day, the Pharisees were divided on this. They were mostly followers of Hillel, but some followed Shammai. Shammai taught, you can divorce your wife for anything that bothers you about her. If she's not as pretty as she was when you married her, which may be the case after 20, 30, 40 years of marriage. If you find someone you like better, you can marry her, or you can divorce her if she's got a bad personality. You could divorce her if she's a bad cook. In other words, Hillel, I don't know if I said Shammai, but Hillel is the one who said this. He says, you can divorce your wife for just about any cause you want to. And that's the way the Pharisees worded the question. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? If Jesus said yes, he'd be agreeing with Hillel. A man can divorce his wife for any cause. Now Shammai, the other rabbi, taking the same passage, said, uncleanness here can only refer to sexual unfaithfulness. If she's committing adultery, for example, then that would be grounds for divorce. But not anything less than that. So the rabbis had their two schools, and some thought you could divorce for any reason you wanted to. Some thought you could only do it for something very severe like adultery. Now, when Jesus came, the Pharisees wanted to get his opinion about it. They said, is it lawful to divorce your wife for any cause? He said, have you not read that when he made them in the beginning, he made male and female and said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave only to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? He said, what God has joined together, that is, in declaring them one flesh, God has joined them together. He says, what God has joined together, don't let any man put asunder. That is, don't let a man divide. Don't let man break up a marriage, ever. God put them together. He made them one. You should never break that up. He basically said that marriage is supposed to be for life. But they then said, why then did Moses command to give her a writing of divorcement and put her away? They're referring to Deuteronomy 24, this passage we just read. Why did Moses say to do that? And Jesus said, because of the hardness of your hearts, God permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Then he said, I say to you, he that divorces his wife for any cause other than fornication and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries that woman commits adultery. So Jesus seemed to come down on the side of Shammai on this, that only, as Jesus put it, fornication. Now, what is fornication? We might think fornication refers to sex before marriage, because we have other words for sexual sins like adultery and bestiality and incest and homosexual sex and things like that. Those are all sexual sins, but we usually reserve the word fornication in modern English for sex between unmarried people, premarital sex. The word fornication in the Greek is porneia, and in the Greek language it is used for every kind of sexual sin. For example, in the book of Jude, homosexuality is referred to as porneia. In 1 Corinthians 5, a man sleeping with his father's wife is called porneia. In the Old Testament, adultery is called porneia. Being a prostitute is called porneia. So porneia, which is translated fornication, or modern translations usually say sexual immorality, it's kind of an umbrella term for all kinds of sexual sin. Certainly, homosexual sin, adultery, pedophilia, bestiality, prostitution, all of those are different forms of sexual sin, and they all are covered by porneia in the Greek language. So Jesus is saying if a man divorces his wife on an occasion where she has not committed some kind of serious sexual sin, then he is not free to do so. And if he does so and he remarries, he's committing adultery. Why would he be committing adultery? Because he's still married to his first wife. But he divorced her. Yeah, in the sight of the society, but not in God's sight. When you get married, you make a covenant that's supposed to be for life. It is possible to break it. And if you marry somebody and they do break it with fornication, then there is the option of divorce. But although you don't have to divorce, I had a wife when I was young who committed adultery repeatedly against me. I wouldn't divorce her. I had the option, but I didn't think it would please the Lord. She finally left me and divorced me. So, you know, I was out of that marriage. If she hadn't divorced me, I'd still be married to her today. Very unhappily, I'm sure, but I'd still be married. Because when you make a covenant, you're making a promise to God and to that person. And God wants you to, even if you swear to your own hurt, not change, you know. But there are circumstances where you are free to be released from that. And that would include when your spouse has committed fornication. I would say when they continue to do so unrepentantly. If your spouse commits fornication and repents, I don't think you should then punish them by divorce. But it does, of course, break trust. And it's a very horrible thing to be married to somebody who's been cheating. Yes?
Well, what do you think about in situations like domestic abuse and like where there's violence happening?
I believe that when a woman or the children are in physical danger, they should leave the home. They should go to a safe place. Biblically, the examples would be a woman would go back to her dad's house. But of course, it might happen in a home where the woman's father is no longer living. Or in our society where the father doesn't want her back. You know, doesn't want her in his home. He's done with her. But that's not necessarily the same thing as grounds for divorce. A lot of times if a woman separates from an abusive husband, before long he'll give her grounds for divorce. That he'll go out and have another woman or something like that. I mean, a woman in that situation may find herself free from the marriage eventually. But I don't know that physical abuse is exactly the same as adultery. It certainly is a horrible thing, inexcusable. And a woman or children who are in danger should be, you know, removed from that danger. And if she doesn't have a father or someone to take her in, or she can't live on her own, the church should take her in. You know, the church should be her protecting family. And the church should confront her husband, by the way. I don't think churches do this very faithfully, but that's what family does. In Old Testament times, if a man was beating up his wife, probably her brothers would come over with clubs, you know, and say, this is not okay. You do this again and we'll crack your skull. Or she could flee to them. But a lot of times families don't look out for each other like they used to, and therefore the church should, but the church doesn't either. That's what the church ought to do in a case like that. I don't believe a woman has to live under physical abuse. And I do believe that, you know, if her husband, if he never becomes safe to live with again, she might live permanently away from him. But that wouldn't mean she'd get divorced and remarry necessarily. Now, if he goes off and sleeps with someone else, then I would say she's in a position to do that, to divorce or remarry too. But yeah, there's a lot of different scenarios, and you kind of have to take them case by case. But the main thing is that Jesus said if you divorce your spouse for reasons other than fornication and remarry, then you're committing adultery. There's a lot of Christians and non-Christians in our society living in adultery by that definition. And since the Bible says in a couple of places those who commit adulterers will not inherit the kingdom of God, that is something to be taken very seriously. Be interesting to talk about that the rest of the day, I'm sure, but that's chapter 24. There's also a reference in chapter 24 to administering justice in the courts. And at the end of chapter 24, there's a law of gleanings. And that is that after you harvest your grain or after you bring in the vintage of your grapes, you're supposed to leave some behind for the poor. You're supposed to not take every last head off the stalk, every last cluster off the vine. Take the majority of it, but leave some behind for the poor. And then the poor were allowed to come along behind the reapers and gather for themselves and for their families. This is how Ruth survived initially. In the story of Ruth, she was a Moabite woman who came to live in Bethlehem among the Jews, and she began by, as a poor person, collecting heads of grain that were left behind for the gleanings. Gleaning is the term used for that very thing. There's a harvest, and then people come and glean what's not taken. I know some people who practice what they call urban gleaning, which means they get food out of dumpsters. But I wouldn't want to do that. But I've known people who do that. They call it urban gleaning. Well, I guess so. Now, chapter 25 has a variety of things in it. One of them is in verse 4. It has that law, you shall not muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. We've talked about that. More toward the middle of the chapter, there's laws about the Levite marriage. That if a man marries a woman and dies, he dies without children, then it's a great tragedy. He doesn't have anyone to carry on his name and his inheritance. So if he has a brother, then his brother is supposed to marry her. Even if he has another wife already, he's supposed to take her and have at least one baby with her. The first son born of that union would be named after the deceased brother, so that the inheritance of the deceased brother would be passed down to that child as if he was the son of the man who died, but he's really the son of the man's brother, the closest relative they could find. Now, if he didn't have brothers, then someone else who was a close relation, and there's laws given about, uncles or cousins or whatever. The idea is that a man who dies childless is leaving nothing for the next generation. He's not contributing to the future. His inheritance is lost, and his name is forgotten. And so, someone close in relation to him has to help him out. Take his wife, who's a widow now, have a child by her. This actually was a practice before Moses' time in the Middle East. We see it in the book of Genesis in chapter 38. Judah married and had 3 sons. And when his sons were grown, he married off the first son to a woman named Tamar. But the son was a wicked guy, and God struck him dead. And so the next brother was sent in to bear children for the deceased. Onan was the second brother, and he didn't really participate. He practiced birth control. He practiced withdrawal and didn't allow the woman to get pregnant. That made God unhappy, and he got struck too. There's one son left, and Judah was kind of afraid to send him into her because he's lost 2 sons with this woman. He doesn't know why, but he doesn't want to lose his third son, so he kind of keeps him to himself. And that leads to her using a ploy to disguise herself as a prostitute to seduce Judah. And it's the story you've already read in chapter 38 of Genesis. But you see that the whole story exists because of this, what's called the Law of Levite Marriage. Levite is a word that means brother-in-law. It's the brother-in-law marriage. The woman loses her husband, she has a child with her brother-in-law then. So you don't have to do that, by the way, girls. We're not under the law. But imagine that. If that was true, then you'd want to not only check out your husband before you married him, you might take a look at his brothers too. All right. Then the only chapter remaining that I wanted to talk about is at the end of that discourse in chapter 26. It's about the first fruits and the tithes. There's been much said about the tithes previously. They have to be brought to the temple once a year, the harvest and so forth. The first fruits are also offered to God before the tithe. When it was time for the harvest of the barley or of the wheat, or later on in the year of the fruit harvest, before the general harvest, they were supposed to take some samples of what had grown and take it to the tabernacle and offer it to God, wave it to God as an offering to him. It was not a major amount. It was more symbolic than anything. It was there to say, God has blessed us with this harvest, God has blessed us with these grapes, and we want to offer the first of it back to him. We see even back in Genesis chapter 4 that we read that when the time came for Cain and Abel to offer their sacrifices, it says Abel offered of the firstlings of his flock. The idea was you take what God's blessed you with and you give God a portion of it first. Even if it's not a large portion, it's not the size of the gift so much as the symbolism of it. You're saying, this, I'm giving God his portion before I get any portion for myself. I'm recognizing him as the source of this blessing, and I'm returning some of that to him at the beginning as an emblem of my gratitude. And then there's also the law of the tithes there in chapter 26. So we've covered most of what's there. In chapter 28, I mentioned that that's an important chapter because in chapter 28 we have the blessings and the curses. And there, the first 15 verses, God says, if you obey my laws and keep my statutes and do all the things I tell you to do, then I will exalt you, Israel, above all the nations of the earth, and you'll be blessed. And he lists all these different ways you'll be blessed. You'll be blessed in your fields, you'll be blessed in your vineyards, you'll be blessed in your homes, you'll be blessed in your wombs, having babies, you'll be blessed in all these different ways. Your enemies will come against you, but you'll chase them off 7 directions, and you'll have plenty of rain and all the blessings that you want. Bless, 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 bless. Then after that, he says, but if you don't obey my voice and don't keep my covenant and don't follow all these statutes, then you'll be cursed. He lists all the same areas, said you'll be cursed in these areas. But he goes further and longer. The curses are much longer. And ultimately, as you read it, he says, finally, you'll be cursed to the point where I'll drive you off the land, and you won't have the land anymore. Now, today, there's a lot of controversy as to whether Israel has the right to the land that they're in now. And many people, including Christians, say, yes, God gave them that land. He gave it to them forever. Well, forever on condition of keeping his covenant. That's what he makes very clear here. And he also did back in Leviticus 26, a very similar chapter. Leviticus 26 also listed the blessings and the curses. And God made it very clear. If you keep my covenant, you can be in this land forever. If you break my covenant, well, then I'll drive you out of the land. You don't have any unconditional claims to this land any more than the Canaanites do. Remember in Leviticus, he said, I caused the land to vomit out the Canaanites because of the abominations they did. If you do them, I'll cause it to vomit you out too. The idea is, you're here on my land on my conditions. If you meet my conditions and are faithful to my covenant, then I'll let you stay. If you don't, you're going to lose it. It won't be yours anymore. Now, the question, of course, is, what is the status of Israel today? Are they keeping the covenant of God? Well, first of all, the old covenant's gone. There's a new covenant has replaced it. Do Jews follow the new covenant? Some do. We call them Christians. Some Jews do keep the new covenant. Some Jews do follow Christ. And just like the Gentiles do, so they're part of what we call the Christian church. But what about the Jews who don't follow Christ? Well, they don't keep any covenant. They don't keep the old one. They have no temple, no sacrifices, none of the stuff the Old Testament is there. And they don't keep the new one because they reject Christ. So on what terms then, even from their own law, even from Deuteronomy, on what terms do we say they own the land? They were driven out in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple and the city because they rejected Christ. Do they still reject Christ? They certainly do. The Jews have not repented of that as a nation. Israel, by the way, is not a religious nation. Some Christians were surprised to find this out. They're not a religious nation. Most of the Jews in Israel don't even practice Judaism, much less Christianity. Many of them are atheists. A very large number of Jews are atheists. Perhaps it may be that the largest demographic among the Jews are atheists. It's very common for Jews to be atheists. But the truth is, the nation of Israel is secular. They're a pluralistic country. They are not a return to what Israel was in the Old Testament, where they were God's people with a temple and worshiping God as a nation and held to the standard of the law. The nation of Israel, the Knesset, the ruling body, doesn't in any way expect people to keep the Jewish law. There's no temple. It's just a secular nation, just like America's a secular nation, or New Zealand's a secular nation. So they don't really have, they haven't met the terms for owning the land. Now, I'm not in favor of driving them out. That's not in my business. I mean, I live in America, and we took it from someone. We took it from the Indians. I'm not saying we should drive the Europeans like me out of America and give it back to the Indians. There is no nation on the planet, probably, that is now inhabited primarily by the people who were first there. The Maoris were here before the Brits in New Zealand. And there were others, I understand, before the Maoris. And that's how it is with virtually every nation. Every nation is controlled by some demographic, some ethnic group that isn't the first people that were there, and their ancestors conquered the people that were before them. So, I mean, that's kind of where Israel's at. The Israelis now, they've taken the land from the Palestinians. They did so under some very unvirtuous circumstances in some cases. I'm not saying that the Palestinians haven't done their share of evil, but both sides have done atrocities. Both sides have committed war crimes. Both sides have practiced terrorism against the others. But Christians are usually blinded to what Israel, the Jews, have done, because Christians think, well, that's their land. They're justified in driving out the Palestinians. Well, are they? When they drove out the Canaanites, they were justified in that because God gave them the land. If they were his faithful people, they could have it from the Canaanites. Has he done that for them against the Palestinians? I don't know. I don't read in the Bible of it. I think Israel has to be judged like any other nation by the rightness or the wrongness of their actions, not by any presumption that they've got some kind of an unconditional right to the land and they can do whatever they want, including wipe out whole villages of Palestinian men, women, and children, which they have done. They did that to the Canaanites, but they're doing that to the Palestinians. That's not quite the same thing. And by the way, what many Christians don't know is there's a higher density of Christians among the Palestinians than there are among the Israelis. The Palestinian church, there's a lot of Christians in Palestine among the Palestinians. There's some in Israel too, but the density is, I think, higher in the Palestinians from what I've read. In any case, God's not a racist. God doesn't favor Jewish people over Arab people. It's true most Arabs are Muslims, which means they're not Christians, but most Jews are not Christians either. They're either atheists or Jewish or Buddhist and other things. New Age, very common. So, I mean, God's, if we're going to favor one group over the other, it's because of race. But God doesn't favor one race over the other. He didn't even in the Old Testament. A Gentile could be in Israel if he was faithful to God. A Jew could be kicked out of Israel if they're not faithful to God. So God's never judged people by race. So when we judge the nation of Israel today and the conflict between the Israelites and the Palestinians, we have to remember that God told them, if they reject his covenant, which they certainly have done, that he would expel them from the land, which he did. Now they're back, and we might have a variety of opinions about what we think about the conditions that brought them back, but the point is, I'm not against the nation of Israel. They're a democracy. They're an ally of the United States. I'm a U.S. citizen. In many respects, I'm on Israel's side. I often like what they do better than what their Muslim enemies do. But that doesn't mean that everything they do is good. And that Israel, like any other nation, has to be judged by their justice or injustice of their own actions. And what you'll find is generally you can condemn some things and approve some things that they do. Same thing with their enemies. And that was the same thing even with Israel when the prophets came. They condemned the injustices of Israel back in the Old Testament. So anyway, this is, Deuteronomy warns that if they break his covenant, they'll be driven out. They did, and they were. And even though there's a nation of Israel there, again, it's not like the old nation of Israel. It's not a religious nation. It's not a godly nation. And it's not there under terms of the old covenant or the new. So that's just guess where we'll leave off with Deuteronomy. We're about out of time. We do have time perhaps for